Okay, so we left off with Barbarossa. The Nazi military was 50 miles outside of Moscow. The Crimea had been occupied, and the siege of Leningrad had started. So let's get to part two, and that would be Operation Typhoon, which was the Battle of Moscow, the invasion of Moscow. Now, again, adding on to part one, we know by this time the German troops, by the time they head to Moscow in late September, they're exhausted. They have been fighting nonstop for a considerable amount of time. They have been around longer, really, than any other military in the war by this point. They have lost men, they've lost machinery, there's some sickness, they're demoralized in some ways. And as I mentioned in part one as well, general winter comes into play. General winter is basically the term for the Russian winter and any military that tries to go into Russia during that time. German soldiers were certainly not prepared. There were no winter clothes. They did not have the right boots, for example. They did not have the right supplies. Why? Part of this was due to pride. Hitler did not want to make it appear as though they may not reach Moscow before winter. So by putting this in their mind, hey, we're going to reach it, we don't even need these winter supplies, that again puts them in a difficult situation as they approach Moscow. We also get to Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Zhukov, one of the most important individuals in World War II. He would lead a counteroffensive from the suburbs of Moscow. This would decimate and demoralize German troops even further. And they would cease their offensive in early November, which would allow for a Russian buildup. But again, now you've got winter here. Zhukov organized civilians to assist, as he did in Leningrad, and would continue to do so. He received 10 divisions from the Siberian force due to Pearl Harbor intelligence. Basically, the Soviets did not have to worry about the Japanese in the east, so they could move their troops to the west. And they were able to deploy forces from that Asian campaign in Mongolia here as well. Thus, by getting out of the conflict with Japan, they're able to use these troops in Europe. This is important because they were battle tested. They were ready to go by the time December came. They have experience. And again, this is all part of the fruits of the labor of the modernization of the army that Zhukov would lead as well. So again, he leads this winter counteroffensive, December 5th, actually 2 days before Pearl Harbor. German armies around Moscow would lose contact with each other. They become fragmented. And again, the attack ends by this time. By Christmas, the Soviet army had retaken the areas around Moscow that the Germans had entered since Typhoon began. And Hitler's reaction, of course, he fires everyone. Now, Stalin had intelligence. He was told the attack would come, Barbarossa in general, but he believed Hitler would try to make peace with Britain first. He thought the military buildup was for blackmail. We're going to get to a little bit of his reaction. Also, Barbarossa is affected by delays due to what's going on in the Balkans and in Greece. Mussolini very much slows down Hitler in his attempts. Now, as I had mentioned, there was some early success. The Nazi troops were close to Moscow. Hitler would divert troops, of course, to the south to assist in the Ukraine. Hitler did not feel the capture of Moscow would be important, but it was the center of the Soviet nation. Its demise would have been a psychological defeat for the Soviet people. Rather, he focused on economics, oils, ores, etc., instead of Moscow. On December 8th, the Nazis would finally suspend operations for the winter. Hitler's generals asked for a retreat. He would refuse. Again, they have no winter clothing. They have no winter supplies. The counteroffensive by the Soviets could not be defended. But for Hitler, retreat was not an option. His generals resign. Hitler would take over military command at this point. Again, he did not want to retreat because he felt it would be a psychological defeat for his troops due to the failure of Blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union and the United States' entry into the war. From February through May of 42, it's somewhat quiet on this front. Now, one thing that's notable, when Nazi forces entered the Soviet Union, initially in Barbarossa to take over provinces, they actually found that people welcomed them as liberators. Many in the countryside did not like Stalin. I wonder why. Maybe because he forcibly starved tens of millions of them, took away their food. Um, they did not like Stalin. They did not like communism. They did not like the idea of collectivization of farming. They wanted to decollectivize these, and they wanted to be able to worship in their churches. This is also important. Again, communism is atheistic, and churches were destroyed en masse, as well as people, again, denied the right to worship at all. Not freedom of worship, they were denied worship altogether. Another thing to keep in mind, too, even during the Bolshevik Revolution, it's the countryside that is not necessarily supportive of the Bolsheviks. They are more in line with social revolutionaries. The Bolshevik Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, the Russian Revolutionary Year of 1917 is so complex, so nuanced. The Bolsheviks win basically because they're in the right place at the right time in Leningrad, or what would become Leningrad, what was Petrograd. But that, again, that did not necessarily bring Russians all together. There were many factions, many revolutionary factions. The Bolsheviks did have a lot of support, obviously, in industrial areas and in future Leningrad. But again, for the countryside, they do not buy into that. So again, you can understand why many of these rural Russians would consider the Nazis their liberators, as strange as that sounds. As far as the Nazis go, though, they do not take advantage of this unease. They treat Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians badly. For example, they would shoot non-communist hostages. They deported civilians as a penalty for terrorism or sabotage. They recruited masses to forced labor, which of course is important to recognize in the dissent you would see. They exterminated tens of thousands of Soviet Jews. Prisoners of war were treated terribly. In 1941, 3.3 million Soviet prisoners were captured. During the last half of 1941, 500,000 of these would die of hunger or cold in Nazi camps. So that tells you the significance of how these prisoners of war were treated, and then how the countryside would react to this. Again, this was a potential assistance for the Nazis, but we know traditionally the treatment or the belief by Prussians of Slavic people is not one that they are equal. And again, this comes through in the treatment. Now, this is one of the ways in which the Nazis truly lost in Barbarossa, because they did not take advantage of the disaffected people who could have been important assistance in that way. And what we see then is we increasingly begin to see peasants begin to fight Nazis instead of fighting the Soviet state. These were called Hiwis, Hiwis. They were volunteer helpers. I'm sorry, the Hiwis were Russians or Cossacks, if you will, who fought against the Soviet state. But again, they would increasingly turn to fighting the Nazis because of their maltreatment. So we've kind of touched upon Barbarossa, the initial stages, early German success. We know that Stalin, of course, disappeared after the operation began. He would come back, he would unite the people, which we'll get to in a little bit. How in the world did the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat? General winter. Russian weather was harsh on German soldiers. Again, this was an early harsh winter, so it was not even a normal Soviet winter or normal Russian winter. They did not have the right clothing. They did not have the right supplies. There was no winter weight oil. The mud froze, which stuck much of their equipment. There were bad roads. Again, the mud. There's lack of railways. They could not bring supplies or reserves easily because of all this. A second reason would, of course, be tactical or strategic mistakes committed by Hitler. Again, think of the delays due to his going into the Balkans. There was no uniform strategic policy between Hitler and the OKH. For example, Hitler wanted to seize territory he believed would cripple the Russian war economy, whereas the OKH wanted to drive toward Moscow. Hitler focused on economic victory, not capturing key cities, and again, he would focus on Leningrad and the Ukraine. Of course, later Stalingrad, which was equally, truly, when you look at strategy, not an important city, but again, it held the premier's name. So they would outrun supplies. Again, with their rapid advance that was necessary for Blitzkrieg, they had limited supplies and they couldn't resupply quick enough. No good railroads. Again, the roads were rough, especially after winter comes. They would run out of food and ammunition. A third reason, attrition. And again, this is the whole reason behind the efforts of Blitzkrieg, a quick surprise attack, an aggressive attack to avoid a war of attrition. The Soviets had numbers, and when we get to the final death toll, the Soviets lost millions of people, both civilians and fighters. But they had the numbers, the Germans did not, and this would play a role. Russian forces retreated rather than engaged at points, allowing them to bring in these reserves and avoid being taken prisoner and avoid mass casualties. And again, kind of sucking the Nazi troops in would allow these numbers to kind of overtake them. There's weak intelligence. Hitler was not able to take advantage as he otherwise might have. There is an underestimation of the Russian soldiers. Again, this goes back to the prejudice against the Slavic peoples. They assumed a quick victory, thus, there were no provisions for winter clothing or supplies. New equipment, especially tanks and aircraft on the Soviet side, surprised the Germans. Again, this is a positive effect of Stalin's industrial program. Tank designs were purchased from Walter Christie. We're going to get to more on who funded this here in a minute. But again, the Soviets modernized, especially after that Winter War, and this was not something the Germans expected. Russian armies historically were not bad fighters, but usually were victims of bad leadership. Not in this sense. Again, Zhukov and Chuikov would both play a major role. And this goes back really a little bit to strategy, but Hitler ordered his new tanks to be kept in Germany until 1942 and his efforts in the Middle East. Another reason, and this is kind of an obvious one, German leaders were scared of disagreeing with Hitler. They knew of the difficulty of going into Russia. They knew the difficulty of a two-front war, but they said little, knowing that they could be fired or, much worse, timing. December 8th, 1941, again, that is when this is completely called off, this invasion. By this time, Japan is at war with the United States. The Soviets are no longer concerned about a Manchurian army attacking Siberia. Thus, again, the Siberian army is brought over, and this only again adds to the idea of attrition and the fact that with all these new numbers, the counteroffensive can be more successful. One other reason Germany was spread thin. Did Hitler go against his goal of one at a time, done quickly? Armored divisions from the Balkans had no time for overhaul and rest between battles. Luftwaffe could not stretch its air cover as the German push increased deeper into Russia. Again, you were going at 3 different areas in a massive country. And the whole point of Hitler's strategy was quick, surprise, aggressive action. Get done quickly, get it over with, and get out. The strategy he took, of course, rendered that moot. So overall, again, overly optimistic, strategic failures, changes of goal during the army, again, from destroying the Red Army and then to focusing on other cities, and again, all this over his advisors' recommendations. Now, a few things if we look at historiography here, Russian revisionism, Wolfgang Strauss and Ernst Nolte. These were German writers, obviously. They agreed with Russian revisionists. They argued that the war was an ideological struggle between atheistic communism of the Soviet Union and bourgeois Christian civilization of the West. The Soviets were threatening Europe and humanity. Hitler wanted to stop its spread. They acknowledged Hitler's brutality, but they argued that Stalin was just as bad. Stefan Courtois, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Courtois, edited a work called The Black Book of Communism, which includes hundreds of stories of mistreatment of people at the hands of communists. Courtois, I think it's probably more accurate, argued that Stalin was worse than Hitler, that communism started the terror prior to Hitler, and he definitely would kill more people over a larger area than Hitler would as well. Now, Hitler, of course, is considered one of the most evil men in history, and of course he was. Stalin, just as bad, if not worse, to be sure. Again, forcibly starving his own people for ideological reasons, not to mention the Great Terror, taking out those who he believed might be a challenge to him. Stalin was not a good dude. But, of course, we know that FDR would call him Uncle Joe. And for political reasons, again, And this is also part of Roosevelt's plan, his necessitarian view, which we'll get to down the road. But we had to befriend the Soviets. We needed them. Again, our anti-communism stretches far back. We fought in the Civil War against them. We did not recognize them until the 30s. We have our own Red Scare again in 1920, but we needed their help, and we realized this. And so, in a way, pragmatism again supersedes ideology during war. The problem, though, was during the peace settlements, which we shall get to. Russian revisionists Pyotr Grigorenko, Viktor Suvorov, Vladimir Rusin argued Stalin was preparing for an aggressive war well before Hitler attacked. For example, more than half of Soviet forces were deep in Polish-occupied territory, which only makes sense that they were deploying for a surprise offensive. They provide other evidence that shows that Stalin was not surprised by Hitler's attack. And when he went into seclusion after the beginning of the attack, it was for other reasons. Another work to check out, Wolfgang Strauss, Operation Barbarossa and the Russian Historians' Dispute, which was published in 1998, which discusses many of these different views as well. There is a 1995 anthology of essays called Did Stalin Make Preparations for an Offensive War Against Hitler? Strauss again argues yes. He cites Stalin's preparations in summer of 1941. For example, he cut Germans off from the Balkans and Romanian oil fields. He destroyed German armies east of the Vistula. He argued Stalin wanted European war of exhaustion, at which time the Soviets could then intervene at an expedient moment. We've kind of talked about this already, that one of Stalin's hopes was that the French and the British would exhaust themselves against the Germans, and then the Soviets either wouldn't have to take part or they could then jump in and take advantage of the situation. Strauss points out, again, that this was part also the goal to spread communism internationally. If you're familiar with Marxism and the overall way that Marx believed that change would occur, this certainly fits that prescription. The Non-Aggression Pact, Hitler invades Britain and France, come to Poland's aid. The focus on the troops in the Western military districts in the Ukraine. His May 5th, 1941 speech to graduate officers in which he declared that war with Germany was inevitable. And again, this was well before Operation Barbarossa would begin. Now, there's proof too. Hitler obviously was going to do this earlier. His press announcement in June of 1941 justified war with the Soviets, pointing out the increasing deployment of Soviet troops along the German border. Again, we're showing that, and that was in spring 1940. So, Stalin is already anticipating this. And again, we get back to some of Molotov's demands to Hitler in Germany prior to Barbarossa. Pre-Soviet scholars would pro-Soviet scholars, would say other things. Quote, in a nutshell, German aggression against the Soviet Union was a godsend, and all its fruit was to be reaped to build up defenses in the Western Hemisphere. Again, this is part of building toward the overall international communist revolution. Stalin was dismissive of warnings of German mobilization efforts on the Soviet border. The military was mobilized. After the initial Barbarossa invasion, again, we know Stalin disappeared in his home for roughly 2 weeks. No one sees or hears from him. Soviet military leadership had been hurt by Stalin's purges. This would hurt the Soviet military not just in Finland, but early on when reacting to this German invasion as well. When the Germans get to the outskirts of their three major cities, they are again turned back. And what some of these scholars argue is that nationalist sentiment, which again is kind of antithetical to Marxism, but hey, pragmatism transcends ideology. Nationalist sentiment was key to the Soviet defense. When Stalin emerged from his self-imposed exile, he appealed to his fellow Russians, even calling them brothers and sisters in his first speech after this invasion. They were now going to defend their homeland at any cost. Soldiers were willing to die rather than be captured. They fought to their last breath for the sake of their country. And indeed, this was Stalin's point with this speech, with his many speeches after the invasion. He brought the Russian people together. We see this in Leningrad. They would defend during the siege. When we discuss the home fronts in a week or so, we'll get more on that. Think of the efforts of those in the suburbs of Moscow, the defensive positions that they created. And of course, when we get to Stalingrad, we're going to see the same thing. So again, these pro-Soviet scholars point to Stalin's leadership, his way to bring the Russian people together, and how this was part of an overall goal, again, the godsend to maximize the opportunity for an international communist revolution. One more thing I want to talk about before we move on, and that is the final solution of the Jewish question. This would be crystallized during this time. Hitler finally put the pieces of this puzzle together, radicalizing his views as he put his nation on war footing and looked to get rid of all obstacles to victory. This came together during the invasion of Russia, as Germany's Eastern Front was now endangered as well. War against Germany's external military enemies would be expanded to include the internal archenemy scattered throughout Europe and Russia, the Jewish population. We'll get more to that here in the next few video lectures, but again, this comes about during this time, and it's in 1942 where we see really the finalization of the plans for concentration camps and mass murder.